So welcome everyone. My name is Kim Amiru. I'm Director of Privacy at ServiceNow. And we have Paula Zenny, who's going to be the incoming Chief Privacy Officer at RingCentral. We're going to be talking about selling privacy products and features to businesses. So we have a couple of polls that you can take just to get a sense of who's in the room. If you don't mind taking with the first one right now, we'll be able to get a better sense of the attendees. And we can look at the results as we go along. So Paula, I'll turn it over to you to walk us through the agenda.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you everybody for joining us. Welcome to this session about selling privacy products and features to businesses. When Kim and I were thinking about this topic, we wanted to address both perspectives. We felt that there are two perspectives to look at selling, and you're selling, but someone else is also buying products and services that may be privacy products or may have privacy features. So we wanted to cover both of those. So Kim will walk us through the key concerns and the key considerations for buyers and share, based on her experience and expertise, what it is that raises flags for buyers and what buyers are looking for. I will then walk you through a little bit of the seller's perspective. And I wanted to clarify that by seller, we don't mean just people who sell what you would define as privacy tech, but we, every technology has privacy implications because it uses data. So in a way, everybody who is a seller of technology that processes data has to be able to be an advocate for the privacy features in their offerings. And so that's why we think of sellers as a broader category. And we'll obviously talk again, build on what Kim said, to talk a little bit about the key considerations for the sellers and what's the best way to overcome buyer concerns. So we'll share some tips, and obviously we'll wrap it up with your question and answer. So how to use the chat, and so please put your questions in the chat. I think we'll take the questions towards the end, because nobody's moderating the chat while we're presenting. Before we move on, I'd like to ask one more question, and before handing it over to Kim, and ask you if you view yourself as acting more in the capacity of being a seller of privacy tech, potentially a developer, or a buyer of privacy tech. And sometimes we may feel we're both, but where do you see you're acting predominantly in as a role?
So as we move to the buyer's perspective, the way we're really considering this is, what do we look for when we buy, broader technology with implications on privacy, but also specifically any technology that's geared for privacy tech, right? So it really comes down to looking for features and products that enhance privacy for us. We're all aware that supply chain is often where enterprises have the most risk introduced, and the way to mitigate that risk is to look diligently at what their vendors are bringing on. But on the privacy side, in addition to the de-risking, there's also the requirements that we have in being able to have privacy programs differentiated for enterprises. So we're looking for ways to really expand and enhance our privacy program broadly. For privacy tech in particular, we'll look for configurability. And this allows us to, for example, address any specific data retention requirements we have. Can I configure the product or feature such that internal requirements? Automation is another key thing that we're looking for. As the landscape within the privacy realm tends to expand and grow based on regulatory requirements or data governance requirements from internal stakeholders, we're going to need to be able to automate that internal policies or procedures and standards that we have, because you just can't throw enough people on the issue or the need. So automation is a key aspect of what buyers will look for. And ease of integration is another one that's essential. None of these platforms or tools will act in silos, and having them integrate with any other system that we work with easily and having a seamless process is also critical for us. Related to that is ease of use. As individual consumers, we're so used to having a very clean and sleek product and technology, kind of the Amazon experience, if you will. And so when we're looking for products that we use internally, we want to make sure that there isn't that kind of required ramp up time that's prolonged in any way. Having that user-friendly process or product is also a useful component that we look for. And underpinning all of this is really documentation around how your privacy features and products work in order for the users to better understand it and get the most out of the product. And some of the things we look at when we talk about documentation is really around what our privacy program entails, right? A lot of the privacy programs will have the general privacy themes or principles attached to it. And so when we're looking for documentation, it's making that internal requirements around completing privacy impact assessments or DPIAs or general vendor review process easy for us. So an example is if the product or feature will start collecting new types of data, we're going to need to think through what our notice obligation is to individuals, or do we have a lawful basis of processing? If we're also collecting any data, it's really can we easily respond to individual rights that are granted in various regulatory regimes. Integration with internal systems is another one that we've addressed, but it's really understanding which systems have impact on the new product or feature that we're onboarding. Similarly, the security measures are going to be key. If there are integrations, are you now expanding the access rights by enabling this product or feature? And then downstream vendors that you're bringing on, what obligations have you put on those vendors? Would they be considered from a very technical privacy term like a sub-processor? And then do we have any obligations that we need to flow down to you so your downstream vendors can also comply with our internal requirements? And then going through these, we wanted to spend a lot of time really thinking through what raises a flag for us, right? Often we're thinking about vendors that are onboarded from a broad technology as a perspective that we're looking for a partner. This is not just a vendor that we purchase one tool from and you don't really revisit the technology later, or you just use it but don't really update or continue to expand your relationship. We want products that really have identified the privacy components that buyers look for. And so there are great things that come out of various technologies, including from artificial intelligence. When we see that right now, we've trained our eye to pay particular attention to it, not because it doesn't have potential benefits, but because the risks that may be contained in that. So for example, if you're using AI as part of your technology, are we going to trigger any requirements around automated decision making? Or are you, what data are you using in any machine learning technology that you have, and what's the output? What does that output look like, and what obligations does it then require us to comply with, both from a legal perspective, but also really from a business perspective on ethical use of data, data governance rules that we may have internally. Again, we keep going back to the integration with internal systems, and in this sense, it's really around, are you integrating with key systems that we have internally, like an SAP or a Workday, and broadening access to data? And so understanding the data flow, both from what's the true source of data, where are you pulling that from, and where do you send that data, or what's the downstream systems that it goes to, is a necessity for us as we assess vendors or technology. And what I'm seeing lately is a lot of use cases for aggregate data. And Again, there is a need for this as products and features want to better their product based on review of any metrics that they may have in place, measuring how their technology is actually used by businesses, but not identifying that clearly, or what you mean by aggregate data. What data are you going to take? How do you use that information? That raises a red flag for us, because it's oftentimes not very detailed. When we're, or even there is no transparency around it. So we're often left trying to find information about it, and being upfront about that will go a long way for your buyer. Akin to this is commingling of customer data. So one of the easiest examples around why this raises a concern for us is if you're commingling any data that has personal data in it with other customers' information, will I be able to respond to the next individual that requests for their data to be deleted or accessed? Are you able to go down to the field level and identify the data that belongs to customer A versus customer B, so that you can enable their compliance obligations? And documentation, we go back to this concept of having very clear documentation. And so anything that we have to look for answers around, and have to go back to our business partners or our product teams around, well, what do they mean when they say X? And they're not able to easily respond to that question. We'll just continue to raise questions and raise flags, and really create a relationship not on the best terms with a vendor that, or a product, or a privacy tech that we would want to continue to use and expand our ability in that relationship with. So now I'll turn it over to Paula to talk about the seller's perspective.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you so much. As you have noticed, and you will notice more also in my segment, we put quite a bit of emphasis on documentation and documenting. Those of you that are familiar with privacy frameworks know that a lot of the compliance with privacy goes through documenting. You need to document the record of data processing activity. You need to document how you comply with the data subject requests. So documentation is really crucial and key. And so it is important for sellers to think, not only to be aware of what their products are doing in terms of data processing, but really be able to provide this in a documented form. So to document a few details. So if you want to go to the next slide, and Kim touched on some of this. Obviously, it's really important to be able to articulate the business purpose for the buyer. The business purpose not only allows to determine whether the processing is lawful, whether there is a legal basis as required by the law, but the buyer would also determine whether it's consistent with the privacy notice that they've provided to data subjects, for instance, and they will also see what they need to do to make sure that this data processing is recorded. So based on the compliance requirement of maintaining activity, is this business process compatible and consistent with the records? Obviously, the data that the product requires in the data flow is also something that buyers otherwise have to figure it out by themselves. So they have to talk to their own IT team, or whoever business owner is going to use this product to figure this out. Obviously, by documenting it beforehand, you definitely you're providing a service, giving a sense of competence and transparency. So that's absolutely important. One other point I want to make sure is clear is also when thinking about the business purpose, is that there should be a certain degree of specificity. So it shouldn't be a very broad and very general business purpose for all the data that you collect, but ideally you'd be able to document how at least certain categories of data serve specific purposes. So we're using this data for purposes of analytics. We're using this other data to enable this functionality or the other functionality. So there has to be a certain degree of specificity. Obviously, maybe 100% granularity is not possible, but I don't even think that buyers look for that. But again, a certain specificity, at least by data category, is really important. Kim touched on the integration, and it is really important to I think the issue of integration for a seller should come when you're designing a product or a service, even before you're selling it. So if something is going to integrate with Outlook, is it going to access just the minimum amount of data that is needed? And can you explain that? And can you articulate how you've applied, data minimization to that extent, to that purpose? And for instance, if configuration is necessary or is required by the buyer to limit certain data collection or to limit data sharing or to limit data transfer, all that should be documented. It shouldn't be in the administrator manual or just in very technical information, because what Kim pointed out is, again, it's a process the buyer is going through, and it's not just a technical process, it's also a legal and compliance process, and you don't want to have those conversations where you are at the moment when you are negotiating a contract. You want the information to have been available and understood beforehand. So if you're moving on to the next slide, the key consideration for our sellers are you have to develop resources for your customers. So your customers going through a review of your technology has to go through a privacy review, has to document that they've done it, and have to document the risks that they have assessed, and also how they've determined that your tool, your device, your application is good, is solid, it fits with their policies, is by using resources. So that should be the key consideration. And that obviously the goal is to make the vendor diligence process easier, but also to smooth the contracting process so that you don't have issues that come up when you're talking with the attorneys or with the lawyers and you're reviewing the agreement at the last minute. And that is a good opportunity also to explain how how you've performed privacy by design and security by design, because that's what enables you to provide those resources and provide that kind of transparency. And this should lead to the ultimate goal, which is overcoming buyer concerns. So when I think about buyer concerns, I think there are two main drivers. One is compliance. Obviously, buyers want to make sure that if they are acquiring anything, it's not going to jeopardize their compliance posture, or it's not going to be in conflict with their compliance requirements, and which could be legal requirement, but could be also their own internal policies, obviously. But there are also concerns that another driver, I would say, of concern is control. Buyers really want to know that they retain control as much as possible over the data. And this is something that the law reinforces and provides. GDPR has gone a very long way in establishing and giving very, very specific rights to the data controllers when they're dealing with data processors. So it's really important to address those two drivers. And, we go back to the point of documentation. You notice this is like a recurring theme for us. Having a good documentation of the privacy feature is really is a selling point, and is something that gives comfort. And because it's documented, is something that the buyer can put away as part of their privacy review or privacy impact assessment. And those privacy features generally focus on, again, to address the issue of control, they focus on, okay, is the collection of the data really what the buyer needs for the purpose? Is this the minimum necessary? And is there also governance around access to this data? And by access, I don't mean just the access by the seller, but I also mean access by the buyer itself. So if they're configuring, if they're bringing an application or a product into their own environment, and this generates additional data or processes additional data, are be able to control and govern the access in their own environment. If there are features that allow for that, those features should be highlighted, it should be showcased. And this obviously is something that facilitates the control over the data. And similarly, whether a product allows and enables data retention policies, for instance, that is critical. What happens to the data, how long it's going to be around, is again an issue of compliance, because data should not be kept as longer than necessary for the original purpose. But it's also important for control. And in this respect, and in this regard, it's very important to be aware and document what's the default situation. So there are a number of products and services for which you can have a default that deletes the data termination, for instance, automatically. Or you could have something that says, well, the default is we're waiting for customers' instructions, or the default is we're returning and we're giving it back. So, it's important to be transparent and really show to the buyer what the default is, because we know that the majority of people do go with the default. So if there is a configuration that is necessary, and if there is a default, usually the default should be the most privacy protective. If for any reason of practicality or maybe business preference, it's not the most privacy protective, then it's really important to bring it to the attention of the customer and say, hey, this product is sharing this information or is transferring this information. This is a default. If you're not okay, you need to configure away from it. And so it's really important to be very transparent. And again, a lot of information is documented in technical material or in the administrator manual, but the administrator manual is something that probably contains a lot of information, and users may go through it with a lot of other concerns in mind, because they're going through a complex implementation process. They may not notice that there are some privacy features there. So it's really important that those are highlighted and showcased. And one of the the opportunities of documenting and providing a good documentation of the privacy features is also to show how you can facilitate the data mapping effort. I mean, every privacy presentation I go to is all about data mapping, and so it's really critical. So how can you do all this? One way that Kim and I were discussing was obviously considering the possibility of building like a trust site or a trust center. So a number of companies have that. If an organization is not big enough or not large enough to have a trust site, you could have some privacy blogs, for instance, preparing some content that you're putting out for your customers, for the buyers to look at. You can also, don't forget that one way to share information is by educating your sales force. So you must make sure that when people go out and sell your products, if they get a privacy question, they don't appear like a deer in the headlights, but they're able to come across as, oh yeah, we know we have a whole program, we do privacy by design, we do this and that and the other, and potentially pointing people to the resources that hopefully you've put together. And similarly, showcasing the privacy features of the product, so those famous configurations I was talking about, that's also important. And one thing to consider is that a lot of companies, for instance, have customer conferences, and usually the customer conferences are dedicated to very technical aspects of the products, and some parts is more salesy. But one option is to have a privacy session there, or if it's a large conference, it could be even a privacy track. I mean, when GDPR came into force, I remember Palo Alto Networks used to have like a whole privacy track as part of their yearly customer conference. That's again another opportunity for your privacy professionals to work with your product managers and engineering to explain those privacy features and educate customers on how to use the potential of for product configuration. So I don't know, Kim, if you want to add anything to this.
Yeah, so a couple of other points that we thought would be useful to consider is, and this goes along the documentation theme that we've talked a lot about, is being transparent. And again, keep in mind that when buyers look at products or features, they're really thinking about what's going to enhance my standing and make my day-to-day privacy work easier. So you want to be able to facilitate that information by being upfront and transparent about what you do. And so to Paula's point, that trust site is one way, or that blog post is another way. But within that, really consider what are some of the things that our buyers would want to know, and how is that relevant for the business purpose in which they are going to deploy my product in. So transparency around, we talked about use of aggregate data or commingling of customer information. That sort of detail will go a long way in making an easy sell to any buyer. Relatedly, it's obtain a third-party certification around your privacy or security posture. And understandably, not all companies are at the stage in which they can get that, whether due to monetary constraints or just the maturity level. But perhaps one way you can address this is to look at what are the requirements of, the trust criteria for SOC 2s or ISO standards, or a SIG questionnaire, and really look at what you've addressed in building and developing your product. And this isn't necessarily something that you may want to share the details of directly with your buyer, but it'll at least help you in drafting your trust site or drafting your white paper about your privacy features and products.
Yeah, this actually one thing I wanted to mention is also that a partnership that is very helpful and I found very valuable, especially maybe for larger organizations, is a partnership with the product certification team. So if you already have someone who's working with the product teams to identify the certifications that are more helpful and also kind of walking them through the process of obtaining those certifications, that is a very valuable partnership for privacy. So if you, again, if the privacy officer of the privacy program is involved, as I think they should, in being an advocate for the products, the partnership with product certification is another important component of all this, for sure.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, a lot of times privacy teams internally wear various hats, right? And so one is leveraging your internal privacy teams as you're selling, to the extent you have any, to be able to display how they may be using your products, right? Kind of the drink your own champagne strategy, and showcasing what it is that they get the most value out of, and displaying that to customers would be helpful as well. And really, it's all about, for at least for Paula and I, when we were talking through this, the clear examples and ease of use and documentation around what are the clear privacy enhancing features is essential for a successful, sell to any team, whether large or small enterprise.
So we want to open up for discussions, questions, things we should have talked about and you want to hear about. So
yeah, we've intentionally left quite a bit of time to really go through what you guys have seen as you're either selling or buying, and considerations that other people should keep in mind. So in looking at some of the questions that have come in,
I'm looking at the list of questions here.
Yeah, Laura's had asked what specific tools or documentation can B2B privacy tech startups use to demonstrate their product's privacy posture. And so I think we talked about kind of at a high level how to identify or display your privacy posture through the customer trust site or blog post or white paper. Granular level, at a more technical level, one thing that I would consider doing is understanding that the buyer is looking to complete most likely a PIA, right, a privacy impact assessment, taking that and trying to fill that out for your buyers, and kind of using that as a rubric for what you may discuss with your customers. That's kind of a very baseline level of review that you can provide your customers. And as you go through your maturity level, you can start looking at the more technical aspects of the third-party certifications that we talked about, or standards that we talked about, and using that as a system to display your privacy features. Paula, I don't know if you have any other points.
So yeah, something that we have created the Palo Alto networks, and I believe there are other companies that have kind of adopted that. One thing that we developed were so-called product privacy data sheets, and I was referred to product documentation, technical documentation multiple times through the session, because we generally, as a company, all companies spend a significant amount of time in putting all those together. But then when you're looking for information that would showcase the privacy features, there's not much out there. And so the product privacy data sheet is one way to do it. And as Kim pointed out, obviously, what kind of information do you want to proactively put in there? You are taking, obviously, as your blueprint, the type of questions that customers, the buyers would ask when they're performing a privacy impact assessment. So obviously, if you're able to provide a good description of the categories of data you're collecting, describing the business purpose, and also providing a data flow that would enable visibility into integration with other applications, but obviously also visibility into access. And sometimes for specific, if there are specific legal frameworks that may apply to you, you may also have some language that addresses how a certain product or feature addresses a certain requirement, if that's important for your market. One thing that's also important to bear in mind is obviously these are documents that you put in place for the buyer, so they're supposed to be somewhat living documents. So when you realize that you get the same question multiple times, then that question needs to be addressed in your documentation, because otherwise, again, you're reinventing the wheel every time.
Question that kind of touched on that I want to address, which is, who do you address the when you're selling the product, or I guess also just creating that documentation? Who do you address that to? Is it to the product, the privacy product, the developer, or the key business decision maker? Well, you can address that, and I can also provide my input.
Well, I admit, because of those drivers of compliance and control, I do tend to make sure that the language is a language that would be clear to a lawyer and to a privacy professional. So that's my audience for that kind of documents. Obviously, because again, the technical person may be able to peruse the more complex documentation to find that information, but that I definitely aim for a general public. I also, going back to the point I was making earlier about the education of the sales force, I think that having good plain English description of these things helps the sales force to go out and, again, be an advocate for the privacy features of a product, of a certain offering. So
I would agree with that. As a practitioner, both general privacy compliance work, but also serving as the role of a legal advisor internally, when I'm looking at products that are being sold, I expect the users of the technology to have that more technical expertise and review the more thorough documentation that might be provided by the company. But I'm looking at your website. That's kind of the first place I would go to when I'm reviewing their vendors. So I would look at your customer trust site. I would look at any blog posts that you've made about questions that I have. And a lot of that is triggered by what you've identified in your contracts. So I want to be able to clearly answer that question for myself. And if you go to the seller, to Paula's point, if your sales force isn't really able to address those questions for us quickly or easily, that's raising additional red flags around, well, what else are you doing with this data? Or how else are you going to be enabling our privacy program and journey, right? So these are definitely questions that you want your documentation to be able to support the less technical people that may be reviewing your product.
I think we have a couple more questions. Somebody's asking whether by deleting the information, what we mean by deleting information, if it's enough to anonymize the information. So that's an interesting question, because so legally speaking, a data processor has the right to choose whether they want their data back or whether they want their data to be purged, to be deleted. So that's how regulators tend to think. They think in terms of deletion. You could, if your technology allows for it, delete all the personal information from, let's say, a record set or a data set, and then you could say, okay, the personal data has been deleted. There may be other data that has been retained. And I think that a couple of challenges are, one, sometimes in a number of agreements, customers want their data to be governed or treated in a certain way, even if it's not personal. So you may not be able to get away with just removing your personal information, because you may still be bound by contractual terms. So you would have to feel comfortable and confident that this is compatible with your contractual commitment. So there is a risk like that. And then it was also, using the term anonymization. Anonymization is a very high standard. So I don't know that it's easier to meet the standard of anonymization than it is to just purge all the data altogether. So I think if you have the ability and the need for non-personal data to remain behind after you terminate the relationship, you would need to frame that very, very carefully with your customers. So be clear, very clear with the buyers that this is what happens. And also how their, not just the privacy, but also the confidentiality of the data is protected. And so I think, I feel that might be a challenging argument to make, but
I mean, I think this goes to the transparency piece that we talked about, right? Like, if you do want to continue using that data for other purposes, or in your for your product, you want deletion to mean anonymization. Be clear around what that is and how you anonymize data. Like, walk your customer through that process so they get comfortable with your ability to do that, and they'll, you know, if it's something that satisfies their compliance obligations and internal obligations, they'll permit you to do that so long as they're aware of the process. So walk them through how you actually get that done.
So then I see another question in the chat asking about the pitfalls of creating this documentation. I think there are few. Some are obviously, every time you generate documentation and you put it out there, the issue of keeping it accurate and making sure it remains accurate over time and doesn't become obsolete is obviously important. So you have to have a clear ownership for that document. So someone has to monitor so that if there are any changes in the products or new releases or new feature, that your privacy by design and your privacy review or product review process includes the task of updating that documentation and keeping it current. So that's really important. Also because there may be customers that want to incorporate those into the agreements. So sometimes the negotiations, they find this information very helpful, very useful. They don't think it's covered anywhere else. And so they say, hey, can we have this as an exhibit to our contract? Which obviously, if you provided, if you develop them, you know, in an accurate way, should not be a problem. But obviously then you have to have the mechanism that says, you know, that these documents may be changed from time to time. So even if you attach them to an agreement, they, you know, they may be subject to future revision. So those are a little bit the pitfalls to pay attention to. Another thing you may want to pay attention to is very enthusiastic Salesforce people who decide they need it in a different language and they go off and they prepare a translation and you're not aware of it. And then one day pops on your radar that, look, there is a German version of this document. So that's
and there's a German version that's, you know, 2 years old, right? To your point around making sure that there is an owner of that document is key. One other pitfall that I've seen is that it can sometimes be too markety, like marketing people created, and be too salesy in a sense that it's not really addressing the current state. It's, you know, talking about future functionality that is being planned, or it's addressing concepts that have been discussed and may very well be on the roadmap, but is not describing what your product currently does. And so that creates a problem when your buyer has assumed certain offerings or certain capabilities, but that's not what you've delivered to them. And so that again creates a strenuous relationship at the beginning, which you just don't want to have with your vendor, with your buyer.
I see another question about third-party certifications. It's expensive and out of reach for many micro enterprises. Any tips? I believe Kim mentioned it when we were looking at the pro tips. You know, you could still look at the controls, use the controls as a little bit of your kind of internal compass for to review your products and your solutions before they hit the market. You would obviously need to you're not going to be able to say that you're certified, so you wouldn't be able to use that label or that seal, but you may still be able to say, you know, we have internal processes that review, or our security by design or our privacy by design program align with the controls of, or take into account the control. So you need a little bit of lawyering in this language, obviously, but that could be one way to do it. So it's some of these frameworks are really very helpful as a blueprint for what you're doing. And so you could use that without expecting to go through a certification process, which again is time and money consuming. And then you could probably still hint at the fact that that you're applying, that you're aligning with those. And eventually, when the time comes and you're big enough to go through the certification process, you have already developed the internal discipline and internal governance to which is going to make it easier rather than when, companies are trying to go for a certification, and up to that moment it's been total chaos. And so then now you need to bring order there. And so it's.
Yeah, I think you hit on a key point there, which is 2 points actually. One is that as you continue to your maturity process and get more revenue to be able to go after those certifications, you're not having to start from scratch if you've already defined and aligned your development process or your controls to match various certifications or frameworks, right? So it helps you with that piece. And the second piece is, keep in mind that buyers are looking at vendors that tend to have those certifications. Even if you don't have those, that doesn't mean you're out of the game for being able to sell into that company. What you can say, as Paula mentioned, is that we're aligning our processes to match this, or we've designed our internal processes to match certain requirements. And so it's helping your future ability to sell and gain those certifications, but it's also going to help you in your current state to be able to notify your customers about what frameworks you're using internally as you do your development process. And I see one other question in here around what would sway your decision the most when deciding between multiple vendors. So for us, what we would tend to look at is who's the buyer, right? The privacy team may not necessarily be the team that's a determining factor, or the buyer. So how do you allow the buyer to achieve their business purpose? That's kind of the baseline requirement. But then secondary to that is, are you integrating with our internal systems in a way that's seamless? And are you going to allow us to continue to comply with our legal obligations as well as our internal obligations and standards? So if there's a vendor that can clearly kind of demonstrate that, that's the one we'll likely lean towards, and not the vendors that we have to do a lot of configuration or a lot of firewalling, so they're not accessing the data. We're uncertain about their security measures. If you're able to clearly check the boxes that we would typically look at, like configuration, your data flow is clean and clear and easily understood, you have identified your use case and the categories of data that's necessary, you've addressed our questions around anonymization, aggregate data, commingling, like those kind of things are easily understood. So that's the vendor we will at least advocate for as a privacy team.
Yeah, I think I call this. I think walking into a conversation with a vendor, and asking questions that pertain to privacy, and having a vendor who says, "Oh yeah, we did this. This is a document. This is our white paper. This is this." It's incredibly reassuring. So it obviously strengthens the decision a lot, and also obviously the fact that in order to implement privacy features, you don't have to rely on IT. So watch those defaults. I mentioned the defaults here in my presentation. So if there are defaults that then require the privacy team to go to IT when they're implementing this solution, and be glued at the hip during all implementation to make sure that they check all the different configuration boxes to preserve privacy, it's incredibly tiring and time consuming. It's much better to go with a vendor who says, "Oh, this is the default," and somebody would have to deviate from the default. And so you can give much more precise instructions to IT. You can say to IT, "Okay, implement everything based on the defaults. If you deviate from the default, you come for approval," rather than having it the other way around. So that's pretty critical.
I think we're just over time. There's one last question around the risk in publishing data flow maps or mitigating controls that we've decided to that the company may have around any risks identified, what could be available on a website versus on request only. I think that's a great question, right? Because as I said, one of the first things that I would do is look at your website to gain as much information as I can about what you have. Obviously, identifying all of mitigating controls that you may have may expose or bring in a certain level of threat to your company. So that's not the information that I would expect to see on your website. What I'm really looking for on a trust site or a blog post is about your philosophy on data privacy, right? It's what information do you see as necessary for collecting data to be able to run your service? How do you enhance the privacy program of your buyers? giving details around, your vendors that you have that may access the data that's processed within your system. That sort of information is what I would look for. What I would look for from a more detailed data flow map is probably upon request, and definitely not on your website. That's the type of information that I would, equate to data you might see in a certification or a SOC 2 report or ISO, a statement of applicability, right? That goes into a bit more detail that you don't want to hand out freely and post on your website.
Yeah, there's definitely a balancing act between what you want to share publicly and what you would put behind. And you can still have a portal where people can, in a somewhat semi-automated fashion, request, for instance, a SOC 2 report or an ISO certification, or a penetration test summary if that's something that you also have available. But you would then put that behind a wall and have them go through, for instance, the execution of a non-disclosure agreement before you sharing that. But there should be a certain amount of information that you can share, because I think the buyer is ultimately entitled to some of that. So some of the information that Kim just described has to be available. Obviously, you have to exercise a little bit of judgment in deciding when the granularity is too much and you will be revealing, because it's confidential information about your architecture. You obviously don't want to do that.
And I recognize we didn't go through the poll, but it looks like a vast majority were privacy professionals. There were definitely some VCs or entrepreneurs in the room. And again, most were sellers of privacy, about 25% were buyers. So we've addressed kind of both hats, right? Both the buyer and the seller. And thank you for attending. And thank you, Paula, for co-presenting.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a great one, everyone.